that's the conclusion of the formal media address after the 2+2 dialogue, the historic first ever 2+2 dialogue between the United States of America and India. We have now Arun Singh, former Indian diplomat, ambassador to the United States of America and many other countries, now joining us live for more. Arun Singh, thank you so much for being with us here on Wion. Help us understand, what do you make of this 2+2 dialogue and the statements that have come out from India and the US?
What struck me, paying close attention to the statements of the various leaders, was that on few issues there were common thread. One critical area where each one of them spoke and along similar lines was the Indo-Pacific. And therefore clearly there is a recognition that the Indo-Pacific region, which is going through a lot of ferment, a lot of challenges to the existing security architecture because of the rise of China, is going to be an important area for potential cooperation between India and the US. At a time when they have some differences in other areas, there are differences on economic issues, there are differences on issues related to Afghanistan, Iran, Russia. This is one area, the Indo-Pacific, which will provide the ballast for the strategic convergence between India and the US. And that's why there's so much focus on that, and they were talking about that. The second area, again, where there is commonality is on the subject of terrorism. Each of the speakers spoke about this issue because there have been challenges to the US, there have been challenges to India, there have been challenges to what the US is trying to do in Afghanistan because of Pakistan's support to terrorist groups. So this is an area, again, which they highlighted. And the third area that came through very clearly is defense cooperation, because this is going to be an important growing area of cooperation between the two countries. Our Raksha Mantri spoke about how the defense cooperation between the two countries has changed dramatically, and it has changed the nature of the relationship. And going ahead, she highlighted that next year there will be the first ever tri-services exercise between the two countries. Many of them, at least three of them, referred to the fact that CONCASA, the communication agreement about security of communication equipment, has been signed now. And it has been indicated that as a result of that, there can be higher level technology releases for India for defense equipment, something that would benefit India also. Another interesting thing that I noted was that our defense minister said that India, aside from engaging with the US Indo-Pacific Command based in Hawaii, which broadly in this area of responsibility covers from the west coast of India to the west coast of the United States, is also going to engage with the US Central Command and have some cooperation with the US Central Command, because that is responsible from the US perspective for issues related to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and again areas of interest to India. So this would be something new that is emerging from this. And then she also spoke about Indian companies to be part of the US supply chain for defense equipment. Because if we are to have more defense cooperation, if we are to build defense industry in India, so that would again be important. And recently there have been reports of US companies and Indian companies coming to agreement where Indian companies would manufacture parts for global supplies coming from the US. So these were some of the that cooperation that were highlighted in the statements that came out from the leaders.
Right, Mr. Arun Singh, if I were to ask you, you spoke about all the things that came up, but what about the things that didn't come up, that rather intentionally didn't come up, be it the oil being imported by India from Iran, or the S-400 missile system purchase from Russia? These two are important factors that would define India-US relationships going forward, but the first ever 2+2 dialogue didn't broach these two topics.
Well, I'm sure these topics would have come up for conversation either within the 2+2 or in the separate bilateral meetings that the ministers had with their counterparts. It's just that they didn't touch upon these in their public statements. So on Iran, for example, as happened in the period between 2012 to 2015, most likely the Indian importers, because of their own self-interest, because India formally does not recognize the US sanctions, because those are unilateral sanctions, but out of their own self-interest, because many of those companies have interests in the United States, they will end up reducing purchases from Iran so as to avoid US sanctions. So I think both didn't want to come up with this publicly, and the US doesn't want publicly at this stage to indicate that when they are talking of significant reductions, what is the figure that they have in mind? So they are playing it in a way to maximize sort of pressure on countries around the world so that they come up with maximum reductions. So as I said, I'm sure this issue was discussed, but they don't want to take a public position. Similarly, on Russia and CAATSA, the issue is bound to be discussed, but I would say that the expectation in India would be that given the authorization that the US administration has received from US Congress, as and when India does purchases from Russia, there should be waiver from US sanctions. And that would be in the interest of the US. Secretary Mattis himself, in public hearing before the US Congress, said that it is in US interest to exercise these waivers because many of these countries have deep relationships with Russia.
Right. Mr. Arun Singh, if I were to also ask you, this whole matter of recognizing India as an equal partner, this 2+2 dialogue, how much and how far do you think it goes in US and India being more equal partners than they were before?
Well, India would always see itself as an equal partner because India has carried out its foreign relationships with all countries, trying to maintain the strategic autonomy of its decision making. And that's why it has good relations with US, with Russia, with Japan, with the European Union, and is attempting to build cooperation in some of its relationships with China. So that has been India's effort right through, whether you have the 2+2 or you don't have the 2+2. What the 2+2 has done is a signal that the two countries now see greater convergence in their political and military strategies. And Indo-Pacific clearly is one area, but not the only area. And therefore, there is a message both to their own bureaucracies, because in both countries, this is a relatively new relationship. And both countries, there are people who doubt whether the relationship has really advanced as much as the leaders are projecting, or whether it will continue to advance in the same direction. Because again, as you know, in India, there are a lot of doubts people raise about the uncertainty created by the Trump administration. So there is a message from the 2+2, both to other countries and to the bureaucracies and others within their own countries, that we see a lot of convergence in the relationship. We are taking it to a new level. India has declared a major defense partner, and there is a convergence of political and strategic interests. So that's the important dimension.
And how do you see China and Russia receiving the goings-on of today and those statements made by the representatives from US and India?
Well, as far as Russia is concerned, it is a very, very important partner for India. More than 60% of our defense inventory is from Russia. At very critical times, Russia has provided political support for India, and that's very important. So I think Russia will understand that India is widening its options, building other relationships, keeping its own interests in mind. And Russia does exactly the same, because Russia is building a very strong cooperative relationship with China. It does defense cooperation with China, and Russia is also reaching out to Pakistan. So each country tries to maximize its equations with other countries, keeping its own interest in mind. So I think Russia would factor in that this is part of India's effort to look at its interests, to build its strategic autonomy. And as far as China is concerned, certainly they'll be watching this carefully, because in the United States itself has a very close relationship with China. The US trade with China is of the order of $500 billion. Chinese investment in US Treasury securities is of the order of $1 trillion. So if you just look at the relationship between those two countries, it's a very intense relationship. So while countries have close cooperation relationships, they also build other relationships, other options to hedge their interests. So again, China itself has a very close cooperation with Pakistan, and provides a lot of economic, military assistance to Pakistan. It has a relationship, growing relationship with Russia. So I think Chinese would watch it with a certain amount of perhaps caution, certain amount of interest.
Right.
But it's a fact of life, because as China expands its footprint in the region around India, in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, in Nepal, clearly India would also need to build its other relationship to deal with the consequences of this.
Arun Singh, former Indian diplomat, joining us live here on Wion. Thank you, Arun, for being with us. Let's now take this across to my colleague, Wion correspondent Siddhant Sibbal, who now joins us live from India's capital, New Delhi. Siddhant, so that formal media address is over. Sushma Swaraj and Nirmala Sitharaman and James Mattis and Mike Pompeo have made their statements to the media. Talk to us in terms of what happens after this as part of this 2+2 dialogue.
Well, the biggest development which has taken place just 2 minutes after that briefing got over was the joint statement. It has been issued just 1 minute ago, and a strong statement on Pakistan. India and US have asked Pakistan to expedite the 26/11 terror case in the joint statement. Important statement coming, and have also denounced terrorist proxies which are using Pakistan as its Pakistan's territory to stage attack on India and Afghanistan. Important statements coming in the joint statement. Specific mention of Pakistan, both India and America calling on Pakistan to expedite a 26/11 case, which will be marking 10-year anniversary this year. So important development on that. But if I can go through the key deliverables which took place in that press conference was on defense. Lot of outcomes on defense. Two major outcomes. One, that the COMCASA was signed yesterday evening. The cabinet had given approval to it, and today it was signed. It will give interoperability when it comes to American and the Indian militaries. They can exchange information. Other, of course, is a hotline has been established between the Indian Foreign Minister and her counterpart, Secretary of State Mr. Pompeo, and the Indian Raksha Mantri, the Defense Minister, and her counterpart, the Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. Other than that, another deliverable was that tri-services exercise is going to take place on the eastern shores of India in the year 2019.
Right.
And the CENTCOM, which is a Central Command of America, not the Indo-Pacific Command, will also have a representative of India. So a lot of important developments taking place, which will have not only implications for the region, but for the entire world, and especially Indo-Pacific.
Right, Siddhant, also later in the day, the representatives from the US, that is James Mattis, Defense Secretary, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, will be meeting Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi as well.
Yes, of course, all the four ministers will be calling on the Indian Prime Minister here in New Delhi, and of course this 2+2 dialogue is the highest political level engagement platform between India and the US, and of course maiden also. And if we look at the warmth and the time both the ministers spent in New Delhi is enormous. They spent an entire day together, and it's for the first time both the Defense Secretary and the Secretary of State are going to any place, and they're coming here in Delhi together for the first time. They haven't been to any other country together, so this is another first in the entire 2+2 dialogue. But if we compare it with the Pakistan trip of the Secretary of the State, Mr. Pompeo, that was a cold trip. He was welcomed by a junior grade officer, 21 grade officer. He just spent few hours there, and of course he left without a joint press conference. There we have it, the Pakistani foreign minister doing his press conference alone, trying to explain what happened, and here we have it, all the ministers speaking on one platform, on one podium, and telling about the convergences. And if we look at the body language also, they talked about how both all the four ministers, both the elements, the foreign minister and the defense minister, having a common approach on the entire issues of convergences, especially on the defense, because this entire 2+2 will be remembered for the outcomes on defense. And as the minister Sitharaman said, that hesitation of history in the defense sector tear has been shed, and today that breakthrough has been achieved. One of the key documents when it comes to India-America engagement, the LMOA, has already been signed, and today COMCASA was signed, and just one is left, BECA, which the negotiations are still going on. But this is a big day when it comes to defense engagement between the Americans and the Indians. And of course, if we look at other key elements which are mentioned, the fact that the Indian foreign minister mentioned that we are growing our energy engagements from America is a strong statement, because yes, Iran wasn't mentioned that many times here, but remember, diversifying its resources when it comes to energy, and Iran is one of the major resources. So there seems to be a kind of recalibration here in New Delhi, because that's an important statement that was mentioned. But other than that, North Korea was mentioned. The Indian foreign minister mentioned the American policy on Afghanistan, and saying that they welcome Trump's policy on Afghanistan. And as we all know, Pakistan joint statement has been mentioned, but all of the ministers mentioned the issue of terror, how it's plaguing the region, and how they have to work together so that the scourge can be removed.
Siddhant Sibal, Wion correspondent, getting us live updates from the 2+2 dialogue in New Delhi. Thank you, Siddhant.